FYF Sports. And we are finally here, man. We are finally here. This is the grand finale of one of the greatest basketball documentaries that YouTube has ever seen. And I would say it's the greatest, and it has to be the self-proclaimed greatest, because this is the most honest take on NBA basketball with the focus on 90s NBA basketball. And again, before I get started with this finality, I have to let you guys know this was not done in hate for the 90s. Again, there were great players in the 90s, just not as many as what you may have been led to believe. But before we get into the video, make sure you guys hit the subscribe button, hit the notification bell, because again, these mini-series videos can drop at any time. There may be other errors, there may be other teams and players that we have to critique with the thorough mini-series documentary to detail the facts and the evidence of the matter. So again, the only way you can stay up to date with all of this information is if you subscribe, hit that notification bell. All right. Anybody who is a subscriber, you have to actively engage in all of the videos. You have to interact with us either on Instagram, Twitter, or here on YouTube. That way you can stay eligible for our weekly giveaways. Now, our weekly prize winner from last week, don't know how the random subscriber generated this person. I don't know how Ticket TV won. This man has failed to accept his prize. If he does not accept it within the next 72 hours, that prize will get forfeited and we'll have to select a new winner. So again, Ticket TV, if you're watching this video, you were the winner of the subscriber giveaway for last week. Make sure you reach out to us, business@fyfsports.com, to claim your prize. Again, I can't be biased to anyone. The only way you can claim your prize, you got to reach out to us by email to confirm your contact information so we can send you your gift card. Now, this is what everybody's been waiting for, the finale. The finale of the mini-series, 90s basketball was overrated. 90s basketball was most definitely overrated. Now, as I've clearly broken this down with point guards, small forwards, power forwards, and centers, I had to save the shooting guard position last, primarily because of the man in the middle right here. The man in the middle, the greatest player of all time, Michael Jordan, is in this particular category, and we have to speak on this man's greatness. All right, so before we even start speaking on Michael Jordan, we do have to run down the top 20 shooting guards of the 90s. We'll break down, how they potentially were or were not effective in the 90s, and if they had a major impact on the 90s or even provided any resistance to Michael Jordan, as he clearly dominated the 90s with little to no resistance. So we're going to go ahead and get started with this, man. We're not going to waste too much time. I really want to breeze through this list so we can get to the man of the hour. The man of the hour is Michael Jordan, but we have to breeze through this list so you guys can have an in-depth understanding of who the top shooting guards were in the 90s. Now, this is my top list. Again, your list may differ. This is just my list. Now, there are some guys that you can throw in, especially the lower guys. You can interchange them. But at the end of the day, I feel like I have a very consistent list with who the top shooting guards were in the 90s era. So, as you can see here, we're going to start our shooting guard list off with Reggie Lewis. Reggie Lewis, one of the top shooting guards of the 90s. This is number 20. Unfortunately, we didn't see the most of what he can do. This man actually passed away in the midst of playing an NBA basketball game to a sudden heart condition. So definitely rest in peace to Reggie Lewis. He looked as if he was going to have a very promising NBA career, but this man was a very solid player. I'm not going to say great or all-star level, but he had a very promising career. It looked like he was going to have a very good career with the Celtics. I'm not for sure if he was going to be able to put up any resistance against Michael Jordan, primarily because he played on the Celtics team in the 90s that just wasn't very good. The Celtics struggled in the 90s mightily after dominating most of the 80s, but definitely losing Reggie Lewis set them back a number of years with regards to development. All right, next up, we got our number 19 player, Nick Anderson. we got Nick Anderson, man. Now, this guy was one of the better shooters of the 90s. I'm not going to say he was an extremely high impact player on that Orlando team. This is an Orlando team that actually did beat the Bulls. Although this was Jordan's comeback year, he wasn't 100%. This was the only team to eliminate the Bulls from the playoff, or eliminate a Jordan-led Bulls from the playoffs. Nick Anderson was known for having a key steal on Michael Jordan towards the end of that game, which sealed the deal for Orlando. But with regards to his career, his career actually did not. It just came to an untimely demise. This man missed some critical free throws in some playoff games, and mentally this man was never able to bounce back after he missed those free throws. His free throw percentage just completely dropped. He completely checked out. It seemed like missing those free throws had such a toll on the man's career. It ultimately forced him out of the NBA, and he just kind of just disappeared and faded away quietly. So again, great shooter, not an all-star level player, solid defender, had a great moment against Michael Jordan in his comeback year, but other than that, a very average player in the 90s. But that's number 19 with Nick Anderson. All right, next up we got Jim Jackson. Jim Jackson, another very solid player, man. I like the man, especially on NBA Jam. Dallas Mavericks is the first team you have to play when you're running through NBA Jam. This man was tough on NBA Jam, but with regards to having a legitimate NBA career, it was just all disappointment. It's all disappointment. Jim Jackson was a very solid player, but that's about the easiest way you can describe him at number 18. Very solid career. He had flashes where he showed he could have potentially been great, but he just never blossomed. When they had one of the first big threes created with Jamal Mashburn, Jason Kidd, and Jim Jackson. And Dallas thought that this would be the future, but for whatever reason, these players could not get it to work, and they all got traded and sent different places. And as we already know, Dallas was just one of the worst teams of the 90s, and Jim Jackson was part of that reason. Again, for whatever reason, they had a lot of talent. They just could never get it to work. Based off some of the things that I read, these guys had a lot of off-the-court things that really stopped them from developing on the basketball court, with the partying, the women, the fame. All of that kind of got to their egos, and they never found the success that they could have had with one of the first big threes ever created in the NBA. All right, next up, we got John Starks. And I got John Starks here because, again, this man showed up time and time again against Jordan in the playoffs. He has one of the biggest highlights on Michael Jordan ever, when he dunked over Horace Grant, and when he also dunked over Michael Jordan at the same time. One of the most famous New York Knicks plays ever in all time. This was actually a play. If you guys see my community post, when he dunked on Jordan and Horace Grant, this was actually a play that was they tried to eliminate it from history on a lot of basketball cards. Especially Topps basketball cards. If you see this play on a basketball court, you'll see that they photoshopped Jordan out of the picture getting dunked on, because they wanted to maintain that GOAT image. They wanted to maintain that image so bad that they started photoshopping Jordan out of these pictures. Now, this play was widely known to have happened in the Knicks community, but back in the 90s, in an era where they're just seeing these highlights on TV or social media wasn't alive, there was a misconception that he only dunked on Horace Grant. In reality, he actually dunked on Jordan and Horace Grant. Again, Jordan and his coalition were trying to control the narrative of the 90s, and they tried to erase that play from history. I don't know why, but it actually happened. But John Starks, a very solid guard, was bagging groceries and got his opportunity to play in the NBA. He showed up, so he was a good journeyman in the NBA. Was never great, was never an all-star, just a solid player, a good shooter in the NBA. All right, next up, we got Jeff Hornacek. Jeff Hornacek was a very solid guard. Wherever he went, he was solid. One of the better shooters, more of a John Stockton type style, kind of a hard-nosed guard. But at the end of the day, he did make a few all-star games. But at the end of the day, I would never say he was one of the greatest players of the 90s. He never put up much resistance to Jordan when the Utah Jazz made the back-to-back NBA Finals. He didn't put up much resistance there. He put up some decent numbers, I would say, when he was in Phoenix. I think he played for Philly as well. But at the end of the day, Jeff Hornacek had I would say a solid career. He was not a player that was just highly feared. He was not going to dominate you by dropping 35, 40 points on you on any given night. He was just a solid player to have on your team that a lot of teams would have loved to have this guy. So he was, again, just a very basic, very solid all-around player out of the 90s. But we got Ricky Pierce. All right, Ricky Pierce, again, just another very solid player. One of the better shooters in the league, especially when he played with Seattle. But again, when we're talking about, especially towards the bottom of this list, we're going to find ourselves having to put very average players on this list. Because again, these were very serviceable role players. They were not all-stars. They were just considered specialists. A lot of the players that I've named before, they were considered specialists, good at one particular thing. They weren't necessarily all-stars or great players in the NBA. Now we're in a guard-heavy league, so just across almost every team, you're going to find extremely talented point guards and shooting guards, mainly because of the era that we're playing in. But with this being a so-called big man-dominated era, Ricky Pierce was one of the better shooting guards in the NBA, but he was just average. Again, would he be able to play in today's game? I would say yes, the man would be able to play in today's NBA, but that was primarily because of his ability to shoot the three ball. But I would think in today's NBA, he would more so be a seventh or eighth man off the bench as a three-point specialist. All right, next up, we got Jerry Stackhouse. Again, Jerry Stackhouse, another very solid player in the NBA. He had some great years, but when we're talking about one of the greatest players, he was extremely athletic. He could do it all. Coming out of North Carolina, this man had a lot of promise. Again, he was just one of those transitional type players that you could plug him in at the 2, 3, maybe even the 4. That was unheard of in that time, but he potentially could have played the 4 in the 90s, just because of his ability to score on all levels of the floor. Now, was he good? Yes, he was good. He had a lot of potential, but he never was able to unleash the full potential of his game's part due to injuries, and then just another part where he just never blossomed into the player that we thought he could be coming out of North Carolina. So with Jerry Stackhouse, again, there was a lot of potential there that I would have loved to see develop just a little bit more. It just never developed into that all-star level caliber player that we thought he could be. He had a long career in the NBA. I would say he turned into a very good journeyman, a very good role player for most teams. But as far as being one of the greatest players of the 90s, he just wasn't. He just turned out to be a very serviceable journeyman. Next up, we got Drazen Petrovic, New Jersey Nets, man. Now, this was one of the few people to kind of go at Jordan, like, with no problem. This man would trash talk Jordan. He would go at him. But ultimately, Jordan was able to pick this man apart in almost every matchup. Drazen Petrovic, again, just like Reggie Williams, his untimely demise. The man passed away in a car accident. And again, this guy could have, he could have been, I would say, if he would have had a full career, he probably would have been in the top 5 of this particular category. But again, another sad, unfortunate, untimely death of a potentially great NBA player. Again, he had the mentality to be great. That's the first thing you always have to check, because again, to be great, the first thing is you got to have a mindset that nobody could stop you. He came into the NBA thinking he was the best player on the Nets. He played with a lot of confidence. He was athletic. He could make shots. Could he play in this era? Well, because he was a foreign player, he could definitely play in this era, because again, we see that foreign style of basketball here in the NBA now. Guys that can make shots, guys that love to play fast. So Drazen Petrovic could definitely play in today's game. Again, just unfortunate what happened to him. Same with Reggie Lewis. All right, y'all, we got Ray Allen. Ray Allen was one of the better guards of the 90s. Again, he's going to go down as one of the top 5 shooters of all time. Again, when he was asked to lead a team, those teams were good. Were they great? No, they weren't necessarily great. He was definitely an all-star in the 90s. He was, when he first came into the league, extremely athletic out of UConn, could make shots anywhere on the floor. But at the end of the day, with regards to winning outputs on a night in and night out basis, you just didn't see that a lot with Ray Allen led teams. Again, he was able to put up what I call empty stats. empty stats, meaning that he was able to score a lot on teams that just weren't considered to be title contenders. And he didn't come into title contention until the 2000s. So again, I want to stick with what he did in the 90s. And with regard to the 90s, he was a good player. He was not dominant. He was not a force that Jordan needed to be worried about, primarily because a lot of the teams that he was on in the 90s never even made the playoffs. So that's Ray Allen for you. All right, we got Steve Smith. Steve Smith, again, just another smooth player. Another smooth player who was on that Atlanta Hawk team. He was on that Atlanta Hawk team with Mookie Blaylock and the Plastic Man, along with Kevin Willis. Again, a good player, very good player. Again, his career just never panned out to be considered great or elite by any level. He was a good role player on every team that he was on. He could make shots. He had a great signature move. But again, with regards to night in, night out, just being the best player on the floor, even being a force that Jordan would see as somebody to potentially worry about, Steve Smith was not that. On the Atlanta Hawks, again, they were a solid team in the 90s. Just in the playoffs, they just never found the success. Even with one of the greatest coaches of all time. They had Lenny Wilkins down there coaching that group of guys, coaching a great team. And for whatever reason, they could never get over the hump, even with Steve Smith on that team. And I think that's when he was in his prime. So we got Steve Smith, very solid player. Played on a lot of bad teams in his career, especially in the 90s, and just was never able to find success in the 90s. All right, next up, we got Hershey Hawkins. Hershey Hawkins of the Seattle Supersonics. This was one of the more hard-nosed players of the league. I'm not going to say he was supremely talented. He just played hard. And that's one thing I do remember about Hershey Hawkins. Now, he had a good three-point shot. Did he present any problems to the Chicago Bulls? If I'm being honest, yes, he did pose matchup problems to the Bulls because of how hard he played. But because he lacked the skill, this man just, even on a great Supersonic team in 96, they had the best record in the league. They had Sean Kemp, Gary Payton, very deep roster, along with Hershey Hawkins. These guys just weren't able to get it done. They made one finals in the 90s. They went one finals in the 90s. They ran up against Jordan and the Bulls. And even as the best team in the league, they were heavy underdogs going into that finals, and they ended up losing that series 4-2. Hershey Hawkins just I would consider him a journeyman player. Not necessarily, he was never really an all-star caliber player. He was just a good player in the 90s. And again, as we start getting closer to the top of this list, you will find a lot of guys on this list who were just good players, or they were able to put up high stat lines on bad teams. One of the common themes that you'll find around the 90s in all of these position categories, especially when I'm talking about some of these top guys. Good players that were just good, didn't meet potential, or good players who put up big stats on extremely bad teams. All right, next up we got Eddie Jones. Eddie Jones, again, this is a player who just ended up playing in the wrong era. Eddie Jones plays in this era. He would absolutely be he would be a great player in this era, primarily because of his athleticism, his flash, his flair, the way he played. He was a very exciting player. So again, I just think he was just a player just kind of birthed in the wrong era. The man could shoot threes. He could do it all. But at the end of the day, when he was asked to lead a team, especially that Laker team that actually struggled in the 90s once Magic left, he couldn't get it done. He wasn't the type that could lead a team, but he would be a great third or fourth option to have on your team if you're looking to make a championship run. So this was one of the players that was traded away from the Lakers when they made that trade to get Kobe Bryant. But Eddie Johnson just never, it never panned out for whatever reason in the NBA for this guy. He never found the right system or the right team that could put him in the right spot. So again, he showed flashes, especially in certain seasons, especially in seasons where he was asked to lead the team. Now again, when he was asked to lead the Lakers, we're talking about a Laker team that was not very good at all, but he put up decent numbers. So a lot of people in the 90s will say this man was great with the Lakers. He was great with some of the teams he played on. But if you look at how those numbers matched up to the team's success, none of those teams actually had very much success in regular season or postseason. All right, next up, we got Allan Houston. Allan Houston, definitely a player that could play in this era. This man can shoot the ball lights out. Crazy score, was able to lead the Knicks to the finals. Unfortunately, they lost that final, but again, that was a Knicks team that had no business even being in the finals. But this man can shoot the ball lights out. Definitely could play in this era because of his shooting, because of his ability to score from the mid-range. And this man's career was just cut short due to injury. This is another player who would be much higher on this list if injuries hadn't have derailed his career. He definitely had Hall of Fame talent. Primarily because of how he helped lead the Knicks to that final. But again, because his career was cut short due to injury, man, we didn't see the best of Allan Houston. But he's definitely a player who could have transitioned to this era. But again, as we talk about what he did in the 90s and how he matched up against Michael Jordan, the man did not put up too much resistance to Jordan, to what Jordan did. Again, this is a common thing with most of these shooting guards or most players at all positions. None of them pose any real threat to Michael Jordan. All right, next up, we got Kobe Bryant in the 90s. Kobe Bryant in the 90s. Now, a lot of people are going to be like, oh, he's not number one. Well, again, we're talking about the 90s. We know that Kobe did a lot of his damage in the 2000s. Well, that's when we saw prime Kobe, or at least towards the end of the 90s. But we were talking about from when he came into the league, those early years, we know he came into the league. He was a role player coming off the bench, and he ended up developing into that assassin that we know. But in the 90s, he was a pretty good player. Even coming off the bench, he made the All-Star game as a sixth man. So that's an accomplishment I have to mention. But Kobe's definitely one of the greatest all-time, definitely top 10. He was one of the few players who did not fear Jordan. He did not fear Jordan at all. It was just unfortunate that the Laker team that he was on was so bad they were never good enough to actually go meet Jordan in those finals. So again, Kobe, I would have loved to see that matchup in the NBA Finals. The only time we really seen those two go at each other was in an All-Star game. We saw Kobe going right at Jordan. But again, Michael Jordan, at the end of the day, was his mentor. Kobe went to Jordan for a lot of advice. And again, we're talking about another player who had an very, very unfortunate demise. As we all know, the helicopter accident with him and his daughter. So again, rest in peace to another player that we're mentioning here. Great career, Hall of Fame career. Nothing bad to say about the man. Supreme competitor, dominant. When he turned into prime Kobe, he was prime Kobe for a long time. But with regards to what he did in the 90s, he was a good guard. He was not necessarily extremely dominant like that dominant Kobe that we saw in the 2000s. All right, next up we got Latrell Spring. All right, and a lot of people you might dispute that I got Latrell Spring over Kobe. But again, we're talking about dominance in the 90s, not dominance over your career. Again, like Kobe's career spanned into the 2000s. Latrell Spring did a lot of his damage in the 90s. He came in again. This is another player who could easily transition into this particular era because of his style of play. All right, the man can shoot the ball, he can score multiple levels, and he's extremely athletic. What primary thing that derailed this man's career? Again, he played on a lot of really, really bad teams. He clashed with a lot of coaches. He's most popularly known for getting into or choking PJ Carlesimo while he was on the Golden State Warriors. He had an extremely long suspension. His career was never the same after that. He kind of resurrected his career in New York, and he had another resurrection in Minnesota when they made that great run. But at the end of the day, we're talking about a guy that, again, this is not a player that put any fear into Jordan's heart. Again, he played hard. He was kind of reckless sometimes on certain teams, especially with that Warriors team. He showed flashes of greatness and promise. He was never able to be a leader of a team. He was always able to score the ball. But again, as we know, when you're putting together, when you're trying to beat Michael Jordan, all right, when you're trying to beat Michael Jordan, the one thing that you cannot be a head case. You cannot be a team cancer. And the one thing that was extremely detrimental to his career is that he's known as a team cancer. Definitely known as a team cancer wherever he's played. All right, next up we got Joe Dumars. Joe Dumars, again, he did some damage in the 80s. Pistons were great in the 80s. So we definitely give him that. When we're talking about Joe Dumars in the 90s, solid career. Definitely a solid career. one of the better defenders on Michael Jordan. He just, again, especially in the 90s, he just wasn't. Once the 90s hit, this man was just not able to do anything with Michael Jordan in the 90s. He was getting old, wasn't fast enough, wasn't the same type of defender. He was still a very solid player in the 90s, but going into the 90s, the Pistons just started to fade away from that greatness that they had in the 80s, and they just were never the same. So, another very good player in the 90s, a solid player, but with regards to being elite or posing any threat to Michael Jordan, this man, once Jordan figured them out, the Pistons were essentially irrelevant to Jordan and the Bulls, and so was Joe Dumars. All right, next up we got Mitch Richmond. Now Mitch Richmond, he's the quintessential representation of 90s players. Put up great numbers. We're able to put up great numbers on extremely bad teams. Mitch Richmond was on a regular basis 25 points a game, 26 points a game, 27 points a game. Extremely efficient scorer. Now, extremely efficient scorer. And again, on 90s, people will tell you that this man was an extremely great player. Yes, Mitch Richmond was a great scorer, but he was a great scorer on a team that was known as one of the worst teams in the 90s. One of the worst teams in the 90s. This man was never able to get into the playoffs to even be competitive. Again, just putting up empty stats on a night in, night out basis on a team that did not have much success. Now, towards the end of his career, he was able to team up with Shaq and Kobe. I think he was able to get a championship towards the end of his career, just being a role player off the bench. But with regards to what he was doing in the 90s, this man was just another player putting up a lot of shots, putting up a lot of points on an extremely bad team. And I call that empty stats, meaning that all of your efforts on the court amounted to nothing tangible that transition into having a successful team in the NBA. And that's another thing that I knock on him. Again, great players figure out how to get it done. Whether you have to defend more, whether you have to get others involved more. Again, Mitch Richmond was a great scorer. But aside from that, the man was a perennial loser in the NBA. Next up, we got Reggie Miller. Reggie Miller definitely go down as one of the top 5 shooters of all time. Relentless energy. And again, if you're a young player and you want to know how to play off ball, watch Reggie Miller videos. Because he's going to teach you how to do that. So again, this is a player that I watched a lot. I'm a 3-point shooter myself. So again, when I wanted to just kind of learn how can I be effective off ball, this is who I watched, and it definitely helped me. But again, this is a great shooter. Now, the only knock that I have on this man's game but he was essentially non-effective for any other statistical category other than scoring. When we're talking about blocks, steals, assists, rebounds, essentially ineffective in all other categories but scoring. All you have to do is look at his stats. And as I did the comparison with Reggie Miller and Steph Curry, as you can see, Steph Curry in half the amount of years, has already far exceeded Reggie Miller in a lot of these statistical categories, such as rebounding, blocks, steals, anything other than scoring. And Steph Curry's on his way to blowing past Reggie Miller in scoring. So my only knock on Reggie Miller was not much of a defender. Although 90s people will tell you that he was a great defender, Reggie Miller was not a great defender. He was ineffective in every other statistical category. And so when I look at the game of basketball, I look at the game of basketball in its entirety. How are you affecting the game? Now, the Pacers had a great organization and a great team. They had a lot of success, although they never were able to beat the Chicago Bulls, but consistently contending with some of the top teams. Reggie Miller was able to put up big numbers, and he was an all-star in the 90s. But again, when I talk about your all-around game and your individual game, again, this man, when you talk about being an all-star who's a role player, Reggie Miller is the epitome of being an all-star who is a role player, because he essentially did nothing else on the court but shoot the ball and score the ball. All right, that's all he did. And again, when we compare his numbers across the board to players like Klay Thompson, players like Steph Curry, even Kyrie Irving, who's essentially a shadow in most of these other statistical categories, these players either match up or surpass where he's at in his full career. And some of these players are still playing, and they've far surpassed him in some of these statistical categories. So that would be my only knock on Reggie Miller. The best thing that I would have to say about Reggie Miller is that Michael Jordan did admit that Reggie Miller and the Pacers were his toughest competition during their 6-year run, or at least during that run where they had 2 3-peats. They said this was the only team that really had a real potential to putting them out of the playoffs and gave him his greatest challenge. It wasn't any of the teams that he faced in the finals. No Karl Malone, no Charles Barkley, no Shawn Kemp, no Magic Johnson in the Lakers, no Clyde Drexler in the Blazers. None of those teams posed a threat like the Pacers did. So again, either that's a knock on a lot of these other great players. And again, I've told you about all of the deficiencies that Reggie Miller had. Through all of those deficiencies that Reggie Miller had, Jordan said that Reggie Miller was his greatest competition. And again, Reggie Miller's deficiencies were extremely clear, especially when you look at his stats, especially when you watch the man play. So what does that say about all of the other guys, the Barkleys, the Shawn Kemps? Are we propping them up too high? All right. Or are they just not as good as what we thought they were? And I feel it's the latter. I feel as if a lot of these players just aren't as great or as good as what we thought they were. All right. And maybe we don't look at what Reggie did and his impact on winning. Now, Reggie did less, but his impact on winning was higher because he sacrificed stats and all of those other categories to do his role. His role on that team was to score the ball. All right. He did his role well. He was a great role player for the Pacers. But at the end of the day, he was never able to overcome Michael Jordan and the Chicago Bulls. Next up, we got Clyde Drexler. Clyde Drexler, man. Now, this man, I consider Clyde Drexler one of the smartest players in NBA history. This man begged his team. He begged his team to select Michael Jordan in the NBA draft instead of selecting Sam Bowie. He says, look, organization. He says, I don't care if we need a big man. I don't care if we already have me as shooting guard. I'll play small forward. We'll make it work. Draft Michael Jordan. He begged his organization to draft Michael Jordan. They failed to draft Michael Jordan. They ended up drafting Sam Bowie, who became one of the biggest busts in NBA history. So again, Clyde Drexler, definitely one of the smartest players in NBA history. And unfortunately, he had to end up playing against Michael Jordan in the NBA Finals in the 90s. And they lost. So Clyde Drexler ultimately ended up being extremely correct with regards to telling his team to draft Michael Jordan. His team did not listen. But Clyde, he's known as Clyde the Glide. Would he be able to play in this era? Yes, he would. The man's extremely athletic, fast, could make shots. Now, I think he's the type of player that could develop a three-point shot. He wasn't a great three-point shooter, but because of his skill set, because of his work ethic, I think he could develop a three-point shot. So could he be effective in this era? I think he could. But we got Clyde the Glide Drexler, a great player in that particular era, was never able to overcome Michael Jordan. And then at the end of the day, Jordan talked down on Clyde Drexler a lot. He did not consider Clyde Drexler his equal. We got Clyde Drexler really high on this list. Jordan did not look at Clyde Drexler that way. He looked at Reggie Miller as being more of a threat. And this is a Clyde Drexler and a Blazer team that was far deeper than any of those Indiana Pacer teams. So again, I gotta go with what Mike says about these players. So again, but I still have Clyde at number 2. And then we'll move on. Obviously at number 1. This is what we've been waiting for, you guys. This is what we've been wanting to talk about. We got Michael Jordan, obviously number 1, the GOAT, the greatest player all time. Now we're gonna break down his game. Offensively, this man was unstoppable. This man was unstoppable offensively. He can get to the basket anytime he want. Patrick Ewing went as far as saying that as soon as if Jordan got off the ground, he's gonna score a layup. You have to foul this man or stop him before he jumps, because if he takes off, he's going to score. I haven't heard that about anybody in NBA history. So offensively, this man knew how to score the ball. He knew how to find ways to score the ball. Could score from anywhere on the court. Now, his only weakness on the court was the three-point shot. He struggled with threes. He was, he was extremely inconsistent. Now, I know he had that one game against the Blazers in the finals. We all remember him shrugging his shoulders after he hit them threes. Well, that's because he shrugged his shoulders because he knows that, That's not his game. And that was the Blazers' game plan going into that game, is kind of sag off of him, back to paint. And he ended up making them pay. So he was able to adapt his game, but over the course of his entire career, Jordan was never a great three-point shooter. That was more so demonstrated in the lone three-point contest that Jordan actually entered. A lot of people don't like to talk about when Jordan entered the three-point contest. And we all know how many shots you get in a three-point contest. All right? You got 5 shots, and I think in 4 to 5 different spots. So you're shooting at least 20 to 25 shots. In a three-point contest in the NBA, at the NBA All-Star game, Jordan only made 3 threes in a three-point contest. See, this is something that a lot of people won't tell you about. So for great as he was, the man was just simply not a great three-point shooter. And that's just being honest about his game. And that's not a knock on him. He's still the greatest scorer of all time, because even with the mid-range, he was able to dominate the mid-range in the 90s. He was able to dominate the inside. The bigs couldn't do nothing with him. So even as good as some of the great defensive bigs were, they couldn't do anything with Michael Jordan. So again, I feel that, again, we give too much credit for all of these so-called bigs in the 90s just being so great inside the paint, being able to stop guys. No, it just wasn't that. For Michael Jordan, it was a cakewalk. Jordan and the Bulls were able to use the triangle offense with very low quality or low budget centers to dominate the NBA for 6 years out of 10, and potentially 8 if he didn't retire. So again, that's a testament to the 90s. Now, here's my biggest knock on Jordan's game. Here's my biggest critique and biggest knock on Jordan's game. And I'm going to take you guys to a video. So a lot of people got Jordan as the GOAT. Now, I still have Jordan as the GOAT, but I'm not going to lie about this man's game or prop his game up to some level that just cannot be topped. And I know a lot of people talk about LeBron James's defense. And because there's just not a lot of video out there of Michael Jordan, a lot of people can't go back and they don't have access to all these games from the 90s. All these games, a lot of times, especially, and this is what people who advocate for the 90s, they use the fact that there's just not a lot of footage that you can find of Jordan in the 90s. There's a lot of highlights. A lot of the highlights that we see are offensive highlights. Or we have the docuseries like The Last Dance that we have to go of. Again, these are all offensive highlights that we see. I feel like the biggest knock on Jordan is, and I think the most overrated, and this is the biggest misconception of the 90s, is that Jordan was just this extremely elite defender. And I'm going to tell you why he was overrated. As you see, we've already went through the list of point guards. There's not a lot of dominant point guards. Point guards were pint size. All right. We went through shooting guards. For the most part, other than Jordan, there are only about 3 other shooting guards that you consider elite or dominant. Now, most of them were on very bad teams who put up big numbers. They just didn't amount to anything. When we went to small forwards, we saw the same thing with small forwards. A lot of good players, nothing great. When we talked about power forwards extremely out of shape, slow. None of them could even jump with Jordan. Once he left the ground, the only thing they could potentially do is foul. All right, and he was still scoring the ball. When we look at centers, there were only about 4 dominant centers in the league. Jordan only had to see them a few times in a year, and even when he saw those guys, he dominated them. The biggest misconception of the 90s is just that Michael Jordan was this extremely elite defensive player who played both sides of the court, when that is absolutely fictional and false. And guys in the 90s will use that myth to prop him up even bigger than what he is. And I keep telling these guys in the 90s, we know that Jordan's the GOAT, but we don't have to make up things about his game. We don't have to create narratives about his game to act as if he's even greater than what he is. Jordan was not supremely elite on the defensive end, because at the end of the day, we know who the elite defender on that particular team was. All right, and then we're about to get to that right now. So let's check this video out. We're about to go ahead and narrate this video, and I'm going to show you why Jordan was not the most elite defender of this particular era. The reason why Jordan was not an elite defender is because he was able to hide behind other elite defenders. All right, and when we talk about elite defenders, the most elite defender on that Chicago Bulls team was Scottie Pippen. Scottie Pippen dominated the defensive end. Scottie Pippen took all the hard defensive matchups. As we can see here, Scottie on Mashburn. All right. As we can see here, we see Scotty making all the defensive stops, all the defensive plays, guarding the best defensive players, even guarding Larry Johnson, guarding Reggie Miller. Again, these are, look at this right here. Glenn Rice. Who's guarding Glenn Rice? Not Jordan, that's Scottie Pippen. When we look at all these defensive plays, who's guarding Cliff Robinson? Scottie Pippen. Who's guarding Reggie Miller? Scottie Pippen. Scottie Pippen is taking all of the tough defensive assignments. He's doing all of the small things on the court. He's playing all the help defense. While Jordan was used as a decoy. Again, there was a myth that Jordan was the greatest player, or at least the greatest defender. He wasn't. And when we look at who made the greatest stops, who took on the toughest defensive assignments in the 90s for the Chicago Bulls team, that's Scottie Pippen on a point guard. That's a small forward on a point guard. Scottie Pippen took all of the tough matchups on David Wesley. Again, that's another shooting guard that Jordan should have been guarding. We look at all of these matchups. Pippen sacrificed all of his offensive energy and output so that Jordan could dominate offensively. He played his role. His role was to be great defensively. As we can see here, he gets the steal. All right, he finishes. Again, this is all the doing of Scottie Pippen. Scottie Pippen again against the Cavs. Another great stop on another point guard. We see him taking those assignments. Same thing right here against the Rockets. Scottie Pippen, again, making the great stops on all of the great players. When we look at the best players on these other teams, who was taking these assignments? It was not Michael Jordan. The myth is that Scottie Pippen was always guarding the best players on these other teams. No, Scottie Pippen would always guard the most impactful player of those other teams. As we saw him guarding Mark Jackson there. Again, we see him there guarding the post. He was big enough to guard 1 through 4 with no problem. All of the tough shooting guard matchups, all of the tough small forward matchups, all of these tough defensive assignments, all of these assignments were typically handled by Scottie Pippen of the Chicago Bulls. He was the elite anchor of the defense. And how do we know he was the elite anchor of the defense? All right, and as we just briefly go over this quote by Phil Jackson. Again, Phil Jackson, his greatest strength was his knowledge of how things worked on the defensive end of the floor. Scottie was the voice of our team, figuratively and literally. So people say that Jordan was the most dominant defensive player of the 90s. Jordan was not the most dominant defensive player in the 90s because according to Phil Jackson, the greatest coach of all time, Jordan was not the most dominant defensive presence on the Chicago Bulls team. It was Scottie Pippen. As we can see, Phil Jackson make the statement, as he did a lot of the talking and he kept our team on the same page. When he wasn't at the top of the key harassing a guard as a special assignment, as we saw in the highlights, he guarded Mark Jackson a lot, who was very impactful at making that Pacer team run. Why? Because Reggie Miller played off ball. He needed a point guard to give him the ball. This is why we have to shut down Mark Jackson. Really smart play by Phil Jackson. Again, and on top of that, it says he was on the backside of our defense, talking to his teammates through different situations, whether it was a double team trap or some other important aspects of the game. Because of that, he was very vital to the run that we made. So again, when we talk about what Phil Jackson said about Scottie Pippen, again, Phil Jackson will even admit, and this is just not one statement. There's multiple statements from Phil Jackson where he says that Scottie Pippen was the best defender on that team. And so when we talk about Michael Jordan, again, a lot of people use the argument that Jordan is the GOAT because he was not only the best offensive player of the 90s, he was the best defensive player of the 90s because he did have a season where he won MVP and Defensive Player of the Year. Again, Jordan was a good defender. He definitely deserving of that Defensive Player of the Year award. I never take those awards away from players. But to say that during their championship run, that during their peak in the 90s, that he was one of the best defenders of the era, no, he wasn't even the best defender on his team. Because again, we have to look at other players like Horace Grant and how much he was doing on the defensive end. We saw how much Horace Grant sacrificed his scoring, all right, just to play defense and rebound. We saw how much Scottie Pippen sacrificed his scoring just to play defense and play make for Michael Jordan. Again, we saw those things happen. We saw those things unfold. We saw Dennis Rodman come in and not have to worry about scoring at all. We knew Michael Jordan could carry the scoring load. All right. what they needed to come in and do, they needed to come in and be great defensively, and they needed to be playmakers, right? And they needed to stay out of the way of Michael Jordan on the offensive end, where he dominated the 90s. Michael Jordan dominated the 90s on the offensive end. I'm just here to dispel the myth that a lot of 90s fans will try to throw at you, especially when we go into the GOAT conversation. They will say that Jordan was the most elite defensive player or the most dominant defensive force in the 90s. He was not more dominant defensively than David Robinson. He was not more dominant defensively than Hakeem. He was not more dominant defensively than Dennis Rodman. He was not more dominant defensively than Scottie Pippen. And we can go on and name a list of players who in the 90s were better defensively, like Mutombo and things of that nature, even Alonzo Mourning. These were all better. They had more of an impact on the defensive end. And that is no knock to Michael Jordan. That's because on this particular team, Phil Jackson set it up so that Jordan did not have to carry the brunt of the defensive liability. They needed Jordan on the offensive end. And if they continue to ask Jordan to give as much of this defensive output on the defensive end and offensive end, there's no way they win 6 championships because he gets burnt out. And Phil Jackson saw that. Doug Collins was essentially burning Michael Jordan out with that particular style of play, putting the brunt of everything on Jordan. So Jordan was a very good defensive player. But to say he was the greatest defender of the 90s is 100% myth. And again, if we look at the shooting guards that he had to guard on a night in and night out basis, how many of them can we say are extremely elite or are extremely tough guards or tough assignments on a nightly basis? When we go through that list, Nick Anderson is not an extremely tough assignment. When we go through Drazen Petrovic was not a very tough assignment for Jordan, although that assignment typically went to Scottie Pippen. We can go through that list, and time on that list, when we go looking at our top players of the 90s, we will see that a lot of the assignments that were given to Jordan on the defensive end were not extremely difficult defensive assignments. And again, a lot of people will take that as some type of hate towards Jordan, or they'll say that it's cap. That's definitely not cap. Again, right today, it's about just exposing all of the myths of the 90s. And a lot of people were able to, a lot of 90s fans especially, they're able to get away from this because there's just not a lot of footage out there, especially in this day and age. In 2020, there's not a lot of footage of players like Ricky Pierce. There's not a lot of footage of a Jeff Hornacek. As good as John Starks wasn't an offensive dynamo. He wasn't going to come out and drop 30 on you. If Jordan's guarding John Starks, he can essentially rest on defense. Things of that nature. Even when we look at some of these other players, when we looking at Kerry Kittles, when we're looking at Ron Harper, who was pretty good offensively before he got hurt. When we're looking at these players, it's hard to say, honestly. Alvin Robertson, another good player, not a threat to Jordan. That's an easy assignment for Jordan. When we look at these players on a night in and night out basis, who is Tony Campbell? Reggie Theus. Was Reggie Theus extremely dominant? Was he a tough guard for Michael Jordan? I don't think so. When we look at Vinny Del Negro, was Vinny Del Negro just that tough defensive assignment for Michael Jordan that he just he had to be locked in every minute defensively? I don't think so. And if he did become an issue, or if he did become a problem, then we know, according to Phil Jackson, that this defensive assignment would turn into a special assignment for Scottie Pippen. Even when we look at players like Todd Day, who's great on NBA Jam, again, just not an extremely elite player that Jordan needed to guard. Again, we can run down the list of all of these assignments that was given to Michael Jordan. When we look at Bobby Phillips, a tough, hard-nosed guard for Charlotte. But, does Charlotte or Bobby Phillips ever pose a threat to Michael Jordan? So again, I'm just here to dispel that particular narrative right there, because again, when people want to have the GOAT conversation, what you need to do is, if you're going to be honest about every aspect of LeBron James, you need to be honest about every single aspect of Michael Jordan, and not just about Michael Jordan, but every aspect about who he actually played. all of this elite competition, the myth that the 90s had all of this elite competition on a night in and night out basis, nobody got a break. Well, I've shown you a number of players over the course of this whole docuseries. So over the course of this miniseries, I've showed you a number of players who are extremely subpar, who are extremely out of shape, who are extremely overrated, or who are extremely pint-sized. All right, I've shown you player after player, and what we've been talking about is we've been talking about the top 20 players in every one of these categories. In every one of these categories. And again, for this to be a big man era, it's just it's hard for me to grasp the concept that this was a big man era and big men were not able to dominate the era winning championships. I don't consider that a big man era. This was a shooting guard era, more specifically a Michael Jordan offensively led era that was dominated by Michael Jordan and a whole bunch of big men that were overrated. And most of these players were overrated so that we can boost up the level of competition that we can say Michael Jordan played against. Michael Jordan said it himself. His toughest competition was Reggie Miller and the Pacers. All right. So for all these 90s fans who like to bring up the Karl Malones, the Charles Barkleys, the Shawn Kemps, I want you to always go back and remember what Michael Jordan said himself. And this is not somebody who's prone, he doesn't like Reggie. Reggie does not like Jordan. We saw how Reggie pushed off on Jordan to hit that game-winning three. These are two players that don't like each other. So for Jordan to come out and say that Reggie Miller and the Indiana Pacers were his toughest competition, that's how we know that's a genuine compliment to that Pacer team. And this is how we know those teams that he played coming out of the Western Conference were not as talented as what we think they are. Jordan did not play significant teams in the finals. All right, people will say that his road to the finals was tougher. Well, we can say that, but as I've ran through all of these players in this particular era, I don't know what players you're referring to because there just weren't that many dominant players that could compete with Michael Jordan. Not on that particular, either they were out of shape, either they were too small, or they were centers that were too slow and couldn't get outside of the paint. Extremely flawed era, and I'm just here to bring out the truth. So that's how we conclude this miniseries, you guys. All right, Jordan is the GOAT. But let's take away that notch on his belt that he was one of the greatest defenders of all time. He's a good defender. He's definitely not one of the greatest defenders of all time. He wasn't the greatest defender on this team. All right, and again, I can name defenders in his era that were better than him. I've named Hakeem. I named David Robinson, Dennis Rodman, Scottie Pippen. That's 4. All right. I could probably keep going. So, again, that's just being honest about the 90s. And I know a lot of Jordan fans will not like to hear this. I know a lot of 90s fans, this is going to be hard on their ears. I know my comments are going to be full of me being, this is blasphemous or I'm capping. No, this is no cap. I have no biases towards any particular era. But this is primarily for, again, all of you LeBron fans out there. And again, if you're trying to make the argument for LeBron being the GOAT, these are the things that you can use. These are the things that you can use because, again, we need to stop putting Jordan on this pedestal, acting as if he had played against such elite competition. When, again, he played in an era that was slower. It was a slower era. Guys were not as skilled. And again, at the end of the day, it was a league that allowed handchecking. And what we know about handchecking is that you handcheck when you cannot guard somebody. If somebody's lightning quick and getting by you all the time, it's just your natural instinct. Go play basketball. Go intentionally guard a guy that you know is faster than you. And as he starts to make his move and you know that you're beat, watch what you instinctually do as you're getting beat. You handcheck or you foul, which now is commonly known as a foul. In the 90s, it wasn't a foul, which is what made Jordan so great offensively. But the handcheck also elevated how he looked on defense. Because let's not act like Jordan did not handcheck as well. And if you go look at the video, Jordan played similarly as well. He wasn't all over the court like Scottie Pippen. As we saw in the highlights, Scottie Pippen and Phil Jackson even explained, Pippen was the anchor of the defense. He took all the special assignments. That was Scottie Pippen. So again, we got to be honest about y'all. So Jordan is still the GOAT. Again, 90s fans, Jordan is still the GOAT. You're still safe. But there are players that could potentially catch him. It's possible. So I just want to make sure that is clear and concise from the jump. But again, this is the conclusion. Probably one of the greatest docuseries that you will ever see. And again, if you want to watch the whole series from start to finish, go to our playlist. Click on our playlist tab and click on 90s Basketball Was Overrated. And you can watch from part 1 to part 5 just so you can see how this develops. Because again, a lot of people watch this single video and have a misconception about what I'm saying. Watch all of them so you can get an understanding of how we came to this conclusion. All right, man. I appreciate everybody for tuning in. This is one of the most epic videos of all time. It's one of the most honest videos of all time. A lot of people don't want to be honest about 90s basketball. I'm just here to bring the facts. We know what FYF means. Forget your feelings, man. All right? We know what the first F really means. All right, we got to keep it PG on FYF Sports right now. Now that we monetize, we got to keep it PG. So for right now, it means forget your feelings. But we know what it means. Feelings are out of the equation. I had to remove my feelings from Michael Jordan for the GOAT for this particular argument. We had to be honest about this man's game. All right, man. Hey, man, make sure you guys like, comment, and subscribe. If you love this docuseries, if you hate this docuseries, either thumbs up it or thumbs down it. I don't care what you do. But again, let me know how you feel about it. If you don't agree, again, the door is wide open. You guys have the email, business@fyfsports.com. If you want to come onto the show, let me know in the email. Hit us up on Twitter or Instagram. We can bring you onto the show. If you feel that this docuseries was not accurate about certain players, come on to the show live. Let's talk about it. That's easy to do. We can always hash it out. We can always talk about this. We can get this sorted out the right way. All right. But man, this was a great docuseries. Probably, like I said, this is definitely the greatest documentary on 90s basketball that you will ever see because it's the most honest. It's the most honest. And again, that's all we have to do. Again, I'm probably going to do something on the 2000s. I'm probably going to do something on this particular era right now. And again, you'll find that same honesty. And that's all that we ask here on FYF Sports. But again, make sure you guys like, comment, and subscribe. Hit that notification bell. Again, we have hit 10K, y'all. Congratulations, man. Congratulations to everybody who's helped us reach 10K. Again, that's definitely a blessing, man. That's definitely a blessing. Been a lot of ups and downs. Again, so it just lets me know that staying up all these late nights, editing videos, putting out this content for you guys, it's worth it. Because at the end of the day, you guys are showing up. I love it when I can pick up my phone and I see comments from you guys. All right, because it shows you guys are engaging, you guys are watching the videos, and you guys care. So that's what I love to see. So I want to see that keep coming. So again, now that we're at 10K, it's no time to get lazy. We're still going to keep these 2 to 3 videos coming out a day. We're going to keep this fresh content. We always going to keep this breaking news coming. All right, again, with the NBA clips, again, we're trying to find a way to get these NBA highlights out. Without the NBA trying to copyright these videos and things of that nature, it's been extremely tough dealing with that aspect of things. But we're going to continue with bringing you our FanDuel tips and strategies. Again, we play FanDuel almost on a daily basis. So I want to bring you strategy videos. What we're going to try to do is, instead of showing you how we pick our lineups, we're just going to do our sleeper picks for the day. Just kind of help you break down who the sleepers may or may not be. Hopefully they work out for you. If they don't, well, you might lose your $1 or $2 for the day. Hey, but another great video, FYF Sports, man. I really hope you guys enjoyed the docuseries and really appreciate your support helping us grow to 10K. Next goal is 100K. And again, hey, let's grind to 100K, y'all. Again, we made 10K happen in less than 90 days. Let's make 100K possible over the next 90 days. The only way that's going to happen is you guys can really grind and help me get there. All right, I'm going to keep putting out this content. Next grind to 10K. FYF Sports, and we out.